Welcome to crazy HOA life. She treated my curb like a towable offense. The tow driver hooked my front wheel, and Stephanie screamed that I had no right to dispute on site, and the car was leaving unless I paid the release fee immediately. "I am writing you up, and you cannot stop it," she yelled, waving a laminated notice template with blank spaces she had already started filling in by hand. I stood there in my blue puffer jacket, hood up, earbuds still around my neck because I had run outside so fast I did not even pull them off. My breath came out in clouds. Fresh snow was falling in fat flakes, the kind that stick to everything and make the world look softer than it actually is. Stephanie Williams, treasurer of the Aurora Pines Reserve Association here in St. Paul, Minnesota, held her coffee tumbler like a prop and jabbed it toward the pile of snow at the end of my driveway. "That is a violation," she said. "That is common property encroachment, and you are being cited for hazardous placement." The tow driver, a guy in a reflective vest with grease on his gloves, looked between us like he was not sure he wanted to be part of this. I could see two neighbors across the street whispering to each other, both holding salt buckets in their hands like they had paused mid-task to watch the show. I work as a restaurant supply rep, which means I drive a branded van full of equipment and samples to kitchens all over the metro. My driveway has a single narrow exit, and snow piles could trap me completely if I let them build up in the wrong spot. I had shoveled everything this morning, pushed the snow to the side like I always do, and gone to work. Now I was back, and Stephanie was standing here with a tow truck and a stack of laminated notices, telling me I was in violation of a rule I had never heard of. I said, "What rule?" She smiled, the kind of smile that tells you she has been waiting for this moment. "Your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead," she said, pulling out a folded sheet from her coat pocket. I could not read the text, but I could see the Aurora Pines Reserve Association logo at the top, printed in dark ink on heavy paper. The tow driver shifted his weight and said, "Look, man, I just got the work order. If you want to dispute it, you gotta talk to the HOA." Stephanie cut in before I could respond. "He can dispute it at the hearing, but right now he is in violation, and the vehicle is being impounded for obstruction." I felt my pulse spike. I said, "Obstruction of what?" She pointed at the snow pile again. "Common egress," she said. "You created a slip hazard and blocked emergency access." I swallowed my anger because I knew the moment to use it was coming. I said, "I shoveled my driveway and put the snow where it always goes." Stephanie shook her head. "Not anymore," she said. "New winter enforcement memo went out last week. Snow must be dispersed evenly across your property or removed entirely. Piling it at the curb line creates liability." I stared at her. I said, "I never got that memo." She shrugged. "It was posted on the portal and sent via certified mail. If you did not receive it, that is a personal address issue." The tow driver hooked the chain tighter, and I heard the metal clang echo across the frozen street. I said, "I am not paying a release fee for a rule I did not know existed." Stephanie pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward me. The screen showed a list of notices, all with dates and tracking numbers, but no readable text. She said, "You have 3 outstanding violations as of today. Snow pile placement, failure to clear within the 72-hour window after the last storm, and improper dicer usage." I said, "Improper dicer?" She pointed at a bag sitting on my porch, a standard sidewalk dicer I had bought at the hardware store 2 weeks ago. "That contains a prohibited chemical," she said. "Sodium chloride concentrations above 15% are banned under the environmental addendum." I said, "It is sidewalk salt." She said, "It is a violation, and each one carries a $50 daily fine until corrected, plus the tow and impound fees if the vehicle remains in violation status." I said, "How much is the release fee?" The tow driver said, $260, cash or card, on site, or it goes to the impound lot and you pay storage on top. I did not have $260 in my checking account right then, not without dipping into the money I keep for my son. I cannot risk missing custody or visitation time because of HOA hearings and delays. If I let them tow the van, I would miss work tomorrow, miss the custody exchange on Friday, and end up in a spiral of fees and excuses I could not afford. I pulled out my phone and said, "I am calling the management company." Stephanie said, "Go ahead, they will tell you the same thing." I dialed the number on the Aurora Pines Reserve website and got a voicemail. The message said the office was closed until Monday due to weather. I looked at Stephanie. I said, "Convenient." She said, "Not my problem." The tow driver said, "Buddy, I need a decision. If you are paying, pay now. If not, I am taking it." I looked at the laminated notice in Stephanie's hand, the one with blank spaces she filled in like a Mad Libs worksheet for fines. I said, "I will pay under protest." She said, "Protest noted. Now pay the man." I handed the tow driver my card, and he ran it through a mobile reader clipped to his belt. The charge went through, and he unhooked the chain. Stephanie smiled and said, "Thank you for your compliance." Then she turned and walked back toward her house, boots crunching through the snow, coffee tumbler still in hand like she had just won a small war. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare stories where the rules make no sense and the payback is always worth it. I stood there watching Stephanie walk away, my van still sitting in the driveway with fresh snow piling up on the windshield. The tow driver packed up his gear and drove off without another word. The two neighbors across the street had gone back inside. I was alone with a driveway full of snow, a bag of banned dicer, and a stack of violations I had not even known about until 20 minutes ago. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and pulled up the Aurora Pines Reserve Association portal on my laptop. I logged in with the credentials I almost never used and started scrolling through the messages. There it was, a post from 8 days ago titled "Winter Enforcement Update." I clicked it open. The memo was 3 pages long, single-spaced, full of clause references and subsection citations. The key line was buried in the second paragraph. All snow removed from driveways, and walkways must be dispersed evenly across the property or transported off-site. Snow piles exceeding 12 inches in height or 18 inches in diameter at the property line are considered obstructions and subject to immediate corrective action. I read it twice. I had never seen this before. I checked my email. Nothing. I checked my spam folder. Nothing. I went to the portal message archive and found the certified mail tracking log. It showed a delivery attempt on my address 5 days ago, but the signature field was blank. I took a screenshot. I called my buddy Marcus, a notary who helps me organize sworn statements when I need to fight vendor disputes at work. I said, "I need your help with an HOA situation." He laughed and said, "Those are always a disaster." I told him the story, the tow truck, the laminated notices, the phantom memo, the dicer violation. He said, "Do you have proof you did not get the notice?" I said, "I have a screenshot of the portal showing no signature on the certified mail." He said, "That is a start, but you need more. You need photos of other driveways with the same snow piles, timestamps, and witnesses." I said, "I can do that." He said, "And you need to request the full winter policy in writing, because if they are enforcing rules that are not published, that is selective enforcement and you can fight it." I said, "How?" He said, "File a records request with the management company, demand copies of all enforcement actions taken in the last 30 days, and compare them. If they only hit you and nobody else, you have a case." I hung up and started planning. I grabbed my phone, put on my coat, and went back outside. The snow was still falling, but lighter now. I walked the neighborhood, taking pictures of every driveway I could see. 3 houses down, there was a snow pile twice the size of mine, pushed right up against the curb. No notice on the door. 2 streets over, someone had a snowblower parked in the middle of their driveway with a mound of snow blocking half the sidewalk. No notice. I took photos of everything, made sure the timestamps were visible, and saved them to a cloud folder. When I got back home, there was a new notice on my door. I pulled it off and looked at it. Same laminated template, same blank spaces filled in by hand with a highlighter used like a weapon on paper. This one said I had failed to clear ice accumulation on the sidewalk adjacent to my property within 24 hours of formation, which was a violation of public safety code and carried a $75 fine plus $25 per day until corrected. I checked the sidewalk. There was a thin layer of ice near the mailbox, maybe 2 inches wide, the kind that forms when snow melts during the day and refreezes at night. Every sidewalk on the block had the same thing. I took more photos. Then I went inside and drafted an email to the management company. I kept it short and factual. I wrote, I am requesting copies of all winter enforcement actions taken in Aurora Pines Reserve in the last 30 days, including notices, fines, and tow authorizations. I also request a copy of the winter enforcement policy cited in the recent memo, as I did not receive the certified mail notification. I attached the screenshot of the blank signature field and hit send. Then, I waited. Monday morning, I got a reply. The message was from someone named Linda at the management company. It said, your request has been received. Per association policy, records requests require a processing fee of $50, payable in advance. Upon receipt of payment, records will be provided within 10 business days. I stared at the screen. They wanted me to pay $50 just to see the proof that they were targeting me. I forwarded the email to Marcus. He called me 5 minutes later. He said, that is not legal. They can charge a reasonable copying fee, but they cannot gain access to enforcement records behind a flat fee, especially if you are disputing a fine. I said, so what do I do? He said, reply and cite the Minnesota Common Interest Ownership Act, Section 303, which requires associations to provide records within 10 business days at no cost if the request is related to a dispute. If they refuse, you file a complaint with the state. I did exactly that. I sent the reply, cited the statute, and said I expected compliance within the legal window. Linda did not respond. Wednesday afternoon, I got home from work and found my driveway blocked. Someone had pushed a snowbank across the entrance, a solid wall of compacted snow and ice about 3 feet high. I got out of my van and walked around it. There were shovel marks on the sides, fresh ones, and a set of boot prints leading back toward the street. I looked around, no notices, no explanation, just a barrier that made it impossible to park. I called the management company. Linda answered this time. I said, someone blocked my driveway. She said, I will look into it. I said, I need it cleared today. She said, we will send someone when we can. I said, when is that? She said, I cannot give you a timeline. I hung up and called Marcus. He said, take photos, document everything, and do not move it yourself. If you move it and they claim you damaged common property, they will fine you for that too. I took photos from every angle, close-ups of the shovel marks, wide shots showing the full blockage. Then I posted on the neighborhood group chat. I wrote, someone blocked my driveway with a snowbank. If anyone saw anything, please message me. 3 people replied within minutes. One said they saw Stephanie and another board member out there earlier with shovels. Another said they heard Stephanie talking about emergency snow relocation due to code compliance. The third person sent me a photo they had taken from their window, showing Stephanie and a guy in an orange puffer coat moving snow with a wide shovel. I saved everything. Thursday morning, I got an email from Linda. It said, per your request, please find attached records of winter enforcement actions. The attachment was a PDF, scanned so poorly I could barely read it, but I could make out enough. There were 12 enforcement actions listed in the last 30 days. 11 of them were on my address. The 12th was on a house 2 blocks away, but the fine had been waived after the owner submitted a doctor's note about a back injury. I forwarded the PDF to Marcus and said, "This is selective enforcement." He replied, "That is your smoking gun, but you need more. You need to show intent. Look for communications between Stephanie and the management company. If she is directing them to target you specifically, that is harassment." I filed another records request, this time asking for all email correspondence between Stephanie Williams and the management company in the last 60 days. Linda replied within an hour. She said, "That request exceeds the scope of routine records access and requires board approval. I will submit it to the board and respond within 14 days. I knew what that meant. They were stalling. Friday was the custody exchange. I picked up my son from school and drove him back to my place. He is 7, obsessed with dinosaurs, and completely unaware that his dad is in the middle of an HOA war. We made pizza, watched a movie, and I tucked him in. Saturday morning, I woke up to another notice on my door. This one said I had damaged common property and must pay $850 immediately or be charged an additional $75 per day. I pulled the notice off and read it again. The claim was that I had caused structural damage to the curb and drainage grate adjacent to my property due to improper snow removal equipment. I walked outside and looked at the curb. There was a small crack near the storm drain, maybe an inch long, the kind of thing that happens every winter when water freezes and expands. I took photos. Then I walked the neighborhood again. Every curb had similar cracks. Some were worse than mine. I documented all of it. When I got back, Stephanie was standing in my driveway. She had her coffee tumbler in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She said, "You have 48 hours to pay the damage assessment or we will file a lien." I said, "I did not damage anything." She said, "The assessment was conducted by a licensed contractor and the findings are final." I said, "I want to see the contractor's report." She said, "It is on file with the management company." I said, "I am requesting a copy." She said, "You can request whatever you want, but the deadline stands." Then she walked away. I called Marcus and told him about the damage claim. He said, "That is a shakedown. Do not pay it. Request the contractor's report, request proof of the assessment, and if they file a lien, you dispute it in court." I said, "I do not have time for court." He said, "You might not have a choice." I said, "There has to be another way." He said, "There is, but it is risky. If you can prove they fabricated the damage claim, you can file a counterclaim for harassment and bad faith enforcement. But you need proof, and you need it fast." I hung up and started digging. I went to the county property records website and looked up recent permits and contractor activity in Aurora Pines Reserve. Nothing. No permits for curb repair, no contractor invoices filed with the county, nothing that matched the timeline Stephanie had given me. I took screenshots of the empty results. Then I called the management company and asked to speak to Linda. She said, "I am not authorized to discuss individual property damage claims." I said, "I am not asking you to discuss it. I am asking you to provide the contractor's report as required by law." She said, "I will pass your request to the board." I said, "The deadline is in 48 hours. She said, "I understand." Then she hung up. Sunday afternoon, I got a group text from the neighborhood chat. Someone had posted a photo of a notice on their door. identical to mine, same laminated template, same highlighter marks. The message said, "Did anyone else get one of these?" Within minutes, 6 people replied. They all had similar notices, all from the last 2 weeks, all targeting sidewalk ice, snow piles, or dicer usage. One person said they had paid the fine to avoid escalation. Another said they were planning to move because they could not deal with the HOA anymore. I replied to the thread and said, "I am gathering evidence of selective enforcement. If you want to join a group complaint, message me." 3 people messaged me privately. One of them was a retired lawyer named Bill, who said he had been dealing with Stephanie for years and was ready to fight. I added him to a group chat with Marcus, and we started planning. Bill said, "You need to force a hearing and make Stephanie defend every claim on the record. If she cannot produce the contractor's report, the damage claim collapses. If she cannot explain why 11 out of 12 enforcement actions were on your property, the selective enforcement claim holds." I said, "How do I force a hearing?" He said, "You send a formal demand letter to the board, cite the governing documents, and request an emergency session. If they refuse, you file a complaint with the state and copy them on it." We drafted the letter that night. Monday morning, I sent the demand letter via email and certified mail. I requested an emergency hearing within 72 hours to dispute the damage claim, the snow pile violations, and the dicer ban. I attached the comparison photos, the enforcement action log, and the county permit search results. I copied the entire board, the management company, and my attorney friend Bill as a witness. Linda replied within an hour. She said, "The board will review your request and respond within 10 business days." I replied, "The deadline for the damage assessment is in 24 hours. If the board does not schedule a hearing before that deadline, I will file a complaint with the Minnesota Department of Commerce and seek an injunction." Bill CC'd the reply and added, "I am prepared to represent the complainant in any necessary legal proceedings. This is your final opportunity to resolve this matter internally." Linda did not reply. 2 hours later, I got a call from Stephanie. She said, "I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "You are creating a hostile environment and the board will not tolerate it." I said, "I am exercising my rights under the governing documents." She said, "You are harassing board members and interfering with enforcement operations." I said, "I am asking for proof of a claim you made." She said, "The proof is on file and you will see it at the hearing." I said, "When is the hearing?" She said, "Wednesday at 6 p.m. Community Center." Then she hung up. Tuesday, I spent the day preparing. I printed every photo, every email, every screenshot. I organized them into a binder with tabs for each violation. Marcus helped me draft a timeline and a summary of the selective enforcement claim. Bill reviewed the governing documents and highlighted every section that supported my case. We practiced the presentation, anticipated Stephanie's arguments, and prepared counter-responses. By Tuesday night, I had a 3-inch binder full of evidence and a plan for how to present it. I could barely sleep. Wednesday morning, I dropped my son off at school and went to work. I spent the whole day distracted, checking my phone every 10 minutes for updates. At 5 p.m., I left early and drove to the community center. The parking lot was half full. I recognized a few cars from the neighborhood. Inside, the meeting room was set up with a long table at the front and rows of folding chairs facing it. Stephanie was already there, sitting at the center of the table with 2 other board members. She had a stack of papers in front of her and her coffee tumbler within reach. I sat in the front row. Marcus and Bill sat next to me. A few other neighbors filed in, including the ones who had messaged me about joining the complaint. At 6 p.m., the board president, a guy in his 60s named Ron, called the meeting to order. Ron said, "We are here to address a dispute filed by a resident regarding recent enforcement actions." He looked at me and said, You have 10 minutes to present your case. I stood up, walked to the front, and opened my binder. I said, I am here to dispute 3 things: a damage claim, a series of snow removal violations, and a selective enforcement pattern that targets my property exclusively. I started with the damage claim. I showed photos of the curb crack, photos of identical cracks on other curbs throughout the neighborhood, and the county permit search showing no contractor activity. I said, the HOA claims I damaged this curb, but there is no contractor's report, no invoice, no permit, and no evidence that this crack did not exist before I moved here. Stephanie interrupted. She said, the contractor's report is confidential. I said, that is not legal. Bill stood up and said, under Minnesota law, an owner has the right to review any assessment that results in a personal financial obligation. If the HOA refuses to provide the report, the claim is unenforceable. Ron looked at Stephanie. He said, do we have the report? Stephanie said, it is being finalized. I said, the deadline was yesterday. She said, the deadline is flexible pending board review. I said, that is not what the notice said. I pulled out the laminated notice and held it up. I said, this says 48 hours, no exceptions. Ron said, we will table the damage claim until the report is available. I said, I also want a refund of the tow release fee because the snow pile violation was based on a memo I never received. I pulled out the screenshot showing the blank signature field on the certified mail log. I said, the HOA claims they sent this via certified mail, but there is no proof of delivery. Stephanie said it was posted on the portal. I said I checked my account. The post was made 8 days ago, but the enforcement action was taken 5 days ago, which means the 72-hour notice period was not met. Bill said, that is a procedural violation and grounds for dismissal of all related fines. Stephanie's face turned red. She said, he is twisting the facts. I kept going. I pulled out the enforcement action log and laid it on the table. I said, in the last 30 days, 12 enforcement actions were taken in Aurora Pines Reserve. 11 of them were on my property. 1 was on another address, and that fine was waived. I pulled out the comparison photos. I said, these are driveways and sidewalks throughout the neighborhood, all with the same or worse conditions than mine. None of them have notices. None of them have fines. I looked at Stephanie. I said, why is that? She said, those properties are in compliance. I said, how is a snow pile twice the size of mine in compliance when mine is a violation? She said, each property is evaluated individually based on context. I said, what context? She did not answer. Ron looked uncomfortable. He said, we will review the enforcement log and ensure consistency going forward. I said, that is not enough. I want all fines dismissed, a refund of the tow fee, and a written apology for the harassment. Stephanie stood up. She said, this is not harassment. This is enforcement. Your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead. I felt the room shift. Bill leaned forward and said, actually, that is the problem. I pulled out a printed email chain, one I had finally gotten from Linda after threatening to file a state complaint. I said, these are emails between Stephanie Williams and the management company. In this one, dated 3 weeks ago, Stephanie specifically instructs Linda to prioritize enforcement actions on my address. In this one, she says to hold other violations until after mine are resolved. In this one, she discusses strategies for maximizing fines and making it difficult for me to dispute them. I looked at Stephanie. I said, this is not enforcement. This is targeted harassment. The room went silent. One of the neighbors in the back row said, can we see those emails? I passed the stack around. People started reading. Someone said, this is insane. Another said, I got the same treatment last year. Stephanie tried to speak, but Ron held up his hand. He said, "This is a serious allegation." Stephanie said, "Those emails are being taken out of context." Bill said, "The context is clear. You directed the management company to target a specific owner using fabricated violations and procedural tricks. That is bad faith enforcement, and it is actionable." Stephanie said, "I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it." She pulled out her phone and started dialing. Ron said, "Stephanie, put the phone down." She ignored him. She said into the phone, "Linda, I need you to pull the file on the damage claim. We have a situation." Bill said, "That file does not exist." Stephanie said, "Yes, it does." I said, "Then produce it right now." She said, "It is at the management office." I said, "Then call Linda and have her email it." She said, "She cannot do that after hours." I said, "You just called her." She said, "She did not answer." Bill said, "This is exactly the problem. You are making claims you cannot support and using procedural delays to avoid accountability." Ron said, "Stephanie, if you cannot produce the contractor's report right now, we are dismissing the damage claim." Stephanie said, "You cannot do that." Ron said, "I just did." He looked at me and said, "The damage assessment is dismissed pending submission of a verified report, which must be provided within 7 days. If it is not provided, the claim is dropped permanently." I said, "What about the other fines?" Ron said, "We will review the enforcement log and issue corrections where appropriate." I said, "I want them dismissed now." He said, "I do not have the authority to do that unilaterally." Bill said, "Then call a vote." Ron looked at the other board members. He said, "All in favor of dismissing the pending fines on this property, pending a full review of the enforcement policy?" 2 hands went up. Stephanie did not move. Ron said, "Motion carries." Stephanie stood up, grabbed her papers, and said, "This is not over." Then she walked out. The room erupted. People started talking all at once, some asking questions, some sharing their own stories of fines and harassment. Ron tried to restore order, but it was chaos. I sat down, feeling the adrenaline drain out of me. Marcus leaned over and said, "You did it." Bill said, "Not quite. You still need to get the refund and make sure they do not retaliate." I said, "How do I do that?" He said, "File a formal complaint with the state and request an audit of the HOA's financial records. If they are hiding contractor invoices, there might be other financial irregularities." I said, "I will do it tomorrow." The meeting broke up around 7:30. People came up to me on the way out, thanking me, asking for copies of the evidence, talking about starting a recall petition. I gave them my contact info and said I would help however I could. When I got home, I sat in my car for a minute, just breathing. Then I went inside, made dinner, and called my son to say goodnight. Thursday morning, I filed a complaint with the Minnesota Department of Commerce. I attached the email chain, the enforcement log, the comparison photos, and a summary of the hearing. I requested an audit of Aurora Pines Reserve Association's enforcement practices and financial records. Friday, I got a call from Linda. She said, "The board has decided to issue a full refund of your tow release fee and dismiss all pending fines." I said, "I want that in writing." She said, "I will email you a statement today." I said, "I also want confirmation that the damage claim is permanently dropped." She said, "It is." I said, "And the winter enforcement memo is being revised?" She said, "The board is reviewing the policy and will issue a clarification within 30 days. I said, "Make sure it goes to everyone this time." She said, "Noted." I hung up and forwarded the call summary to Marcus and Bill. Marcus replied with a thumbs up emoji. Bill said, "Good work, but stay vigilant. They might try to retaliate in other ways." I said, "I am ready." The following week, a vendor blacklists the HOA after Stephanie is caught ordering staged snow photos from a freelance photographer, claiming they were evidence of violations for insurance purposes. The photographer posted about it on social media, someone in the neighborhood saw it, and it went viral locally. The board had to scramble for contractors during the next storm because half the usual vendors refused to work with Aurora Pines Reserve. Stephanie resigned as treasurer 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons. The board issued a memo clarifying the snow pile rule, stating that snow removed from private driveways can be placed at the property line as long as it does not obstruct vehicle or pedestrian traffic, and that enforcement actions require photographic evidence and 24-hour notice. Karen's credibility collapsed in front of witnesses, and at the next board meeting someone asked for her motion on record regarding the enforcement policy, which she could not provide. I got a settlement letter from the HOA's attorney offering a formal apology and reimbursement for all disputed fees. I signed it. Marcus helped me organize sworn statements from the neighbors who had been targeted, and we submitted them as part of the state audit. The audit took 4 months. When the report came out, it found that the HOA had collected over $30,000 in questionable fines over the last 2 years, most of them tied to fabricated or exaggerated violations. The management company was fined, Stephanie was barred from serving on any HOA board in the state, and Aurora Pines Reserve was required to refund all disputed fees and implement new oversight procedures. I got a check for $1,200 covering the tow fee, the release fee, and compensation for the harassment. I framed the letter and hung it in my office. My son asked what it was. I said, "It is proof that sometimes the good guys win." He said, "Cool, can we get pizza?" I said, "Absolutely." Looking back, the whole thing was absurd, but it taught me something important. When someone tries to bully you with rules they made up, you fight back with the rules that actually exist. You document everything, you find allies, you stay calm, and you wait for the moment to deploy the evidence that flips the whole game. For me, that moment was showing the email chain proving Stephanie had orchestrated the targeting. It was a records request response proving they hid documents unless paid bogus fees, and I showed it only after Stephanie repeated her claim one last time, on record. That was the trump card, and it worked. The neighborhood is quieter now. The new board is less aggressive, more transparent, and actually follows their own rules. I still shovel my driveway, still push the snow to the side, and nobody says a word. Sometimes I see the neighbors who joined the complaint, and we nod at each other like veterans of a small war. It is not the life I imagined when I moved here, but it is mine, and I protected it. Stay safe, and I will catch you in the next one.